Welcome to Agatha Christie She Watched, our spoiler-heavy look at the movie and TV adaptations of the mystery genre's greatest writer. I'm Bill Peschel of Peschel Press, publisher of the annotated novels of Agatha Christie, and today we're talking about strange visions, helpful assistance, seaside comedy shows, and magical summers. We're going to discuss Sleeping Murder, the 2006 episode of Agatha Christie's Marple, starring Geraldine McEwan. But first, let me introduce to you my partner in marriage as well as crime of the fictional kind, Teresa Peschel. Hello, Teresa. How you doing?
Hi, it's always a pleasure to be here with you in your little office under the stairs, so snug and cozy, and no, you'll never get a window. A window onto the sea. Maybe we'll get a picture of the sea. Because even if we installed a window, you still wouldn't get a window onto the sea, since the sea is, like hundreds of miles away from our house, unlike Gwenda's house, where she can stand out there on the veranda, and what a nice house that is. Stand out there on the veranda or from any of the windows and gaze out at the English seacoast. I just thought it was so fascinating that when she arrives in London, I guess in whatever port it is, she arrives at the port in London and she meets Hugh Hornbeam, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And she wants to see England. She wants to see the sun and the sunshine. They're going around the seacoast and said, "Oh, this is England." And I'm thinking, wow, you have never considered that so much of England is actually Yorkshire and the moors, which have practically nothing in common with Torquay.
They pride themselves as the English Riviera, where palm trees grow, and you think...
You don't have to dig up your dahlias and cannas in the fall and put them in sandboxes in the basement and then replant them in the spring. You can overwinter your dahlias. You don't even have to put on a heavy mulch. And she's thinking that this is England, and I'm looking at it and said, well, I'm sure it is a part of England, but even though England is not that big, it's still big enough that this is only a teeny portion. It's like judging the entire United States by Florida.
Truth be told, she was living in India all her life, or so she thought. So she had no concept. It's like Englishmen thinking about America and saying, well, we're going to land in Washington and maybe we could drive down to Florida for the weekend. And you go, no, that's not how distances work in this country.
That's not how that works. Oh, yes, we're going to be visiting, and we're going to go to Chicago. And since you're American, you must know someone in Chicago. And said, no, I'm afraid not. A long way from here.
We've seen all the Sleeping Murders so far, and we've actually 2 years ago saw this episode of Sleeping Murder. So between that time and this time, we've had 200 episodes under our belts. 200 adaptations.
200 adaptations of Agatha Christie. Oh, my God.
So what do you think of it?
I like it better. I really enjoyed it. I see a couple of issues, but I think they did a really interesting job of rewriting. And one of the things you have to say for ITV Marple, Joan Hickson was intensely faithful. They were always intensely faithful to the text. And when they weren't, I don't know that they improved it. I still think of that bizarre modern dance sequence in They Do It with Mirrors. And I still have no idea why we were watching that, except that the director's friends needed jobs. ITV, you never know what you're going to get. It can be wildly different. It can be very faithful to the text. They often would inject Miss Marple into non-Marple properties, which is how you get the Sittaford mystery with Miss Marple, or Towards Zero with Miss Marple. And I can just hear some of you right now cringing as you consider Miss Marple inserted into The Pale Horse or Ordeal by Innocence. And sometimes it works great. The Pale Horse, Ordeal by Innocence, it worked great. Inserting Miss Marple into the Sittaford mystery and then completely rewriting the plot so that it had virtually nothing to do with the original novel other than some tidbits here and there. And you think, what on earth were you thinking? That was a train wreck. So you don't know what you're going to see when you watch an ITV Marple, but they are willing to take chances. The estate was okay with that. And of course, you don't know what people are going to like, and the books are still on the shelf. So what ITV's Marple does to the books in a way doesn't matter because they're still publicizing them. I understand that there are people who refuse to watch ITV Marples because they are not faithful to the text. And all I can say is read all my reviews and make your own decision if you're going to watch some of them or all of them, because a lot of them are really worth watching.
It's really a good sign, in fact, that they do things like new adaptations, just like there's images online of Sir Kenny in Venice filming scenes for...
Ooh, already?
Already.
Ooh.
He's filming in Venice as we speak.
And he put Halloween Party there, and
Yep.
that's going to be really strange.
It'll be strange. It'll be interesting. We'll go and watch it, even though we have mixed feelings about a lot of his work. But the point, though, is that it's a great sign when you see new adaptations being made, because it means that the material still has relevance to the people who have the money to make these things, and also, hopefully, to the audience. And they still do. And Agatha Christie, the more we've done these adaptations, the more we've seen things and talked about it, it's really raised my opinion of her. She is one of the giants of 20th century literature, but her influence is so hard to tease out at times. But the more you dig into her stories, the more you dig into her adaptations, the more you realize just how powerful a force she is. This lovely little old lady just sitting back and writing her stories.
Writing her little genre mysteries. Oh my God, how low rent can you go? I mean, the only way you can be more low rent in the literary world than genre mysteries is if you write gasp romance, which is at the bottom of the barrel, even though it makes most of the sales and drives the money. It's like writing, she's a couple of steps above writing movie tie-in novelizations. And she doesn't get the respect that she should. She really doesn't, as a groundbreaking writer. She was a woman. She wrote genre mysteries, and she made buckets of money, all of which irritate a certain class of the literati. They just can't handle that. Remember also, in addition to writing a few novels here and there, she's also the most successful female playwright in the world by a huge margin. And do you see accolades being heaped on her for that? No, you do not. And again, it's because her plays were mysteries. She wrote genre mysteries. Mm-hmm. So she gets no respect from anyone other than her bankers. And yet she's in every library in the world, translated into however many languages there are on Earth. That's how many languages she's been translated in. I doubt if any of them have been missed. She sold more copies than anybody, and her books still influence how people write, the novels and the films and the TV shows that people do today, because the idea is floating around, even though her name is no longer attached to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go ahead and get started with Sleeping Murder, because this is the story of Gwenda Halliday, a young lady who is coming back to England
from India.
From India.
A slight change in the text, because there it was New Zealand.
Okay, New Zealand. And she buys a house pretty much on impulse and instinct in the southwest of England on the coast. And she starts having kind of these strange visions about a body in the house.
She meets Hugh Hornbeam, and let me say right now that if you are a tycoon, an older tycoon, and you have a young, blonde trophy fiancé, you do not send her off to England with a young, reasonably dashing. He's not that dashing.
No, he's kind of schlubby looking.
He's kind of schlubby, but he is still a young man to help her do whatever she needs to do. Don't do it, folks.
Even if he's your assistant.
Even if he's your assistant, one of your hirelings somewhere in the hierarchy.
Now,
don't
in the novel,
do this.
In the novel, it was Gwenda Halliday and her husband.
Yes,
right?
She was already married.
Right.
She bought the house, and then her husband arrived soon after she had the fateful encounter with the Duchess of Malfi, and he was thrilled in the novel with the idea that, we get to be detectives. Ooh! He knew immediately that she was right. It was through Raymond West that she met Miss Marple, and after having the experience with the Duchess of Malfi. So they did a few changes there. She still gets to see the Duchess of Malfi, but in this case with Miss Marple and with Hugh, the eager go-getting assistant who really assists in every way with his boss's fiancée.
It starts off with her having, I wouldn't say visions in this house.
Well,
but
no, I think it started even a little earlier because they're driving down the seacoast and she sees the sign, one that says to Torquay and one that says to Dilmouth. Something makes her decide Dilmouth. Yeah. And I wonder if that wasn't also a residual memory in that she remembered having been in Dilmouth for a year.
Right, because spoilers, she came here with her father when she was 4 years old.
Yeah, when she was about...
she has forgotten that.
She has forgotten that she has been here. She is sure that she grew up in India, raised by her dead father's sister, and her mother had died earlier, tragically, and then her father died of a heart attack, and she was shipped off to India to be raised by her father's sister. And that's the story she was told. But I think it started earlier. I think when she had the choice and she saw Dilmouth on a signpost, she said, Dilmouth, even though it was essentially the low-rent district. It was a day tripper location. There was nothing particularly, as Hugh tells her, there's nothing in Dilmouth. We should go to Torquay.
There's a nice hotel there waiting for us. I'd be happy to take you there and,
But they go to Dilmouth and they start driving through Dilmouth and... they spend a little time on the promenade, and she looks at him and said, wasn't there a pier there? And she's remembering already. Mm-hmm. She doesn't know it, but she's remembering already.
Thought of that.
Yeah, and he says, oh, it was bombed during the war. I'm sure it was.
Yeah, this takes place in 1952.
As they're driving through Dilmouth, she looks up the slope of the land, sloping up and away from the seacoast. There it is. There's her house. She knows instantly, that's my house. And providentially, the house is up for sale. And Mr. Fane has the contract. He is apparently in England, solicitors and real estate agents can be the same person. So he is a solicitor and a real estate agent. Gwenda buys the house because she recognizes something. But once
she's attracted to it.
Yeah, she is attracted to that house. She is drawn to that house.
And here we get also a little bit of an idea of the two characters, because Hugh is very reluctant. He's kind of resistant. And Gwenda is basically, and she does this in the nicest, not in the nicest way possible, but in the firmest way possible, that borderline between being too strict about it. She wants the house.
She wants it.
And she is brought up in a certain way to believe that my way is the highway and this is the way we're going to go. And she really threads the needle there, because she doesn't really come off to me as like strident, demanding, bitchy, to use all the words for usually
for
applied
Harridans.
for Harridans, for female leaders. But it also helps that she is adorable. I must admit, she is just the
hot
cutest
young
thing.
blondes can get away with things that us old gray old gray fat women cannot. We can't get away with that.
You can get away with anything with me, dear. You know that.
But only with you.
But anyway, she buys the house and they start to renovate according to what she wants done.
Now, they did drop one of the pieces of the plot, because as Gwenda is walking around, she does find the door that was missing, that had been boarded over. They do discover the cornflower and poppy wallpaper. She does have the vision of seeing the body in the central hall strangled on the floor from the banister. But they drop the change on the veranda where she is sure that there should be steps here. And then, of course, it's later discovered that the steps were moved in order to cover the body. I thought this was a mistake, because with and yes, we always use spoilers here, what Dr. Kennedy did when he killed Helen, when he strangled Helen, is he threw her over the cliff. Unless you were doing this at low tide, when the tide is going out, this is really chancy, because the body is going to reappear relatively quickly. You have to time this very carefully, and you still have to be darn lucky, because the body is eventually going to show up. I mean, you can't throw a body over the cliff and guarantee that they're not going to be found. It just doesn't work that way.
We saw that in the Russian version of And Then There Were 10 Little Indians, because the body of
Dr.
Armstrong washes up conveniently against the steps.
Against the rocks.
And it can't go out because the waves are so strong they're keeping the body up against the pier.
Oh, yes. In fact, her father, Kelvin Holliday, apparently, as far as Gwenda first thinks that he died of a heart attack, and then she's there and she discovers that he committed suicide by leaping over the cliff to his death, and they found his body on the rocks below. Well, again, throwing a body over a cliff is not good planning. You want to put the body someplace where it isn't going to be found. And if you happen to have a large veranda with a large set of steps, you can decide, and in the novel, this is how it plays out. As Kelvin Holliday recovers from Helen's disappearance, Dr. Kennedy persuades him to build a new set of steps on the side, which is where the body goes. He buries the body, and that's one of the things that Lily Kimball sees from the upstairs. No, it was the nanny who saw that from the upstairs window. And you grow this big, dense hedge, and it covers everything up. You have to put a body where it can't be seen. So I think that was a flaw in the plot, but there was so much good stuff going on. This was a film that actually had a strong Bollywood influence because, of course, we've now seen Gunnam and Dund, where you incorporate singing and dancing into a murder story. Dund actually worked surprisingly well, and this one worked too, because you open in India with dancers and this beautiful sequence of dancing.
It's at a party that at the British legation, some British official party.
In 1934, and Kelvin Holliday, who is some junior secretary, discovers that his wife has just crashed the car. And that was, again, they didn't bring this up, but this is something I would ask the Indian police force. It's like the scriptwriter just didn't think, or they thought the Indian police force was completely incompetent. But you have that party with the dancing and wonderful music, and then you see the Funnybones doing song and dance routines several times, and Evie Ballantyne gets a song. There's a surprising amount of music in this.
We have to interject and say one of the changes the screenwriter Stephen Churchett did was introduce the Funnybones, this troupe of 5 people that was playing at Dilmouth that summer. Apparently they're kind of like a traveling comedy dancing troupe.
And most of these people have novel corollaries, because there's the Erskines, Janet and Dickie. I'm not sure if Dickie was his actual name. And they were a couple that Helen met on the boat back to India, or she met him on the boat to India. I'm trying to remember Sleeping Murder, but she knew who he was, and he was in love with her, and she decided she was not going to, he was a married man, and she certainly wasn't going to break up the relationship, and Janet, his wife, Mrs. Erskine, was extremely jealous. Jackie Affleck was a young man on the make, and he felt sorry for Helen because she was such a wonderful girl. And Dr. Kennedy probably made sure that he lost his position with Walter Fane's solicitor's firm, and he ended up owning a coach line called Daffodil Coaches.
Right, in London.
So he was also part of it. Evie Ballantyne and Lionel Luff are made-up characters. They are new. I don't remember them being in the novel. But Stephen Churchett took characters and he remade them, so they have some aspects, but not all. They certainly, the names match here and there.
Yeah, and the reason why he did this was so that one of the characters in the troupe would meet Kelvin, newly widowed Kelvin, and they would get married. And she would end up not getting married, because it was the night before they were going to get married. And she ends up disappearing.
Yes, she disappears.
And leaves a note behind.
Don't look for me. I'm fine, and I'll be happy, and you'll be happy. And
Kelvin eventually kills himself.
Yes, they compressed a lot of the time here. It's always a perennial summer in Agatha Christie adaptations. It's always a sunny day in June, no matter what time, no matter how much time actually takes in the novels. And I think Agatha actually thought about how much time things takes. The major change, and we'll get this out of or maybe I should go back to the problem that I had with the Indian police force at the very beginning.
Well, the fact that where was the body? Yeah,
where was the body? That really struck me. That struck me then when we saw this the first time, because I put it in my review back in November of 2020. I have it on my computer, so I know I sent it to you, and I know you posted it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but on my sheet that you have we watched it in January of 2020.
Okay, I guess I must not have written enough words for the book. But anyway, that bothered me then. It bothered me when I wrote the reviews. It bothered me when I'm watching this for the second time, and it bothers me now, which is that the Indian policeman, who is probably a reasonably competent man, and the Indian police force is going to be reasonably competent.
It's weird. In other words, it's weird to have a car accident without the body.
Yes, without the body, because you have the car. Oh, it went over into the gorge. Where's the body? There has to be a
gorge
body
so deep that they couldn't go down there. That would be the only. I thought of a couple of ways around that. One is that it's a deep gorge, and I don't know if there are deep gorges in India, but maybe there are.
Well, India is very mountainous in certain portions, so maybe it was. But they didn't say anything about the gorge was so deep so we couldn't get to the car and rescue the body.
Right.
Or the car was on fire and we couldn't get down to the bottom of the gorge to put the fire out to rescue the body. But you have to have a pretty damn hot fire in order to burn a body to ashes. There would be something left.
There's always going to be something
There's always going to be something left.
The other thing I thought about, because after all this is India, they could just say, we can't find the body, we see the blood, we think that maybe a tiger dragged it off into the
bush and ate it. I didn't even think of that. But yes,
India
has tigers, and why would a tiger pass up a free, easy meal? They're
Right.
still big kitties, and why would a big kitty go to the trouble of hunting something when there's fresh meat right there in front of them?
Yeah, probably even roasted. Probably even tastier. Sorry.
Tasty.
We know
Tasty
our
and
cats.
delicious.
We know our kitties.
But that bothered me. I hadn't thought of a tiger, but yes, they didn't say anything like that. And so you're left with the impression that the Indian police force is incompetent. And I don't want you to have that impression coming away. The script was incompetent.
Just about that.
And this is important. And this, again, is why they should have said couldn't reach the body.
Yeah.
Because then,
there's a very good reason.
for a very good reason,
because
and this
they added a twist at the end of the story,
which is a major change from the novel. In the novel, Gwenda has her mother, her biological mother, who dies in India, and then Helen Kennedy, who her father meets on the boat back to England. So there are two separate women. Her mother, Claire, who dies in India, and her stepmother, or the woman who's going to become her stepmother, Helen, whom her father meets on the ship back to England. And the whole point of the body in the car over the gorge, and again, they should have said something about we couldn't reach the car to recover the body, is that Claire, Kelvin Halliday's wife, isn't dead. No, she was about to be accused of theft, and she and Kelvin had worked out this plan where she would, and again, they really compressed the time because this should have taken months, is that she set the car up so it would go over the cliff and burst into flame, and then she disappeared from India, taking the first boat back to England, and she found a little bitty town where no one would ever look for her because Dilmouth is the back of beyond when everybody goes down the English Riviera to Torquay. And for those of you who are familiar with the state of Delaware, what I said to Bill is it's like Bowers Beach compared to Rehoboth Beach. Nobody goes to Bowers Beach if they can go to Rehoboth Beach. But I would say even more now, it wouldn't be Bowers Beach, it would be Kit's Hummock. Nobody goes to Kit's Hummock if they can go to Rehoboth or any of the beach towns. So she picked this obscure little town, and she had to find a way of making a living, as she had been a taxi dancer in a nightclub. And again, you think about an English, not gentleman, but he was definitely gentry class. They had some money. He's a civil servant, maybe like an undersecretary or something, and he marries a taxi dancer.
Again, we don't know that much.
We don't know
about
that
her,
much is
so-
spelled out, but we know that she was a nursery governess who was fired for theft. And maybe it was the real thing and maybe it wasn't, but it turns out she did indeed steal this beautiful ruby and diamond necklace. She has to get out of India, so they fake this whole thing. So she ends up in Dilmouth, where she finds this itty-bitty town where no one will ever find her. She writes back to Kelvin. You don't see this, but she must have. She has to provide for herself. So how does she provide for herself? Does she find a job at the local wool shop and, rent a little one-room bedsit over the wool shop, where she can be in quiet obscurity, where no one will ever find her? Why, no. Instead, she signs on with a theatrical troupe. And I guess this is hiding in plain sight, and she was already talented, and she became their girl singer, dancer, ingenue for their act.
Mm-hmm.
Again, a little more backstory about what Claire would have been, what Claire could do, would have explained why she took a job, why she was able to get a job, even with a fifth-rate touring company like the Funnybones, how she got a job with the Funnybones. And at the same time, that this would let her disappear into obscurity because she chose that town to disappear in because of the theft charges waiting for her back in India.
Well, but at the same time, she's changed her name. And this is, at a time when you don't really have much in the way of communication between England and India, particularly about a common thief. So she could feel very safe. And in fact, she was until Kelvin put the engagement announcement in the wrong newspaper.
He put it in the Times
of London,
which everyone reads. And instead of just keeping it in the single local newspaper where nobody would see it other than people in Dilmouth or Kit's Hummock for the...
No, it's a little bit more. I mean, they did have a pier, and they have obviously a hotel and a music hall, and you could get ice cream on the boardwalk. So
yes,
it really isn't that bad.
Yeah, it's not as bad as Kit's Hummock, which is probably quite built up now because they aren't making any seaside property anymore. And then Kelvin puts in the advert in the Times, and of course, the Funnybones, I should mention, cannot understand why a wonderful performer like Helen Marsden is able to walk away from the stage. Why? How could she do this? They simply cannot understand why she would want to marry. They might understand why she wanted to marry this man, but he has a child already from his previous wife who died. You want to marry and stay here in this back of beyond dump that, you could do other things. You could do more. You could go places. You could be a star. Well, and they don't understand it.
Yeah, but some of them didn't, because after all, Dickie settled there as well with Janet.
Yeah, they came back to Dilmouth after the war.
Mm-hmm. There was no reason why they couldn't have just formed another troupe and moved on. I mean, certainly plenty of performers out there.
I think it was partly because their son was 11 and needed his father. And that's why they got out of they did various things. We don't really know. So there's Helen Marsden. And yes, she is Claire. She is Claire. And this was another weak point, I thought, in the story, because they managed to compress most of the novel into a few minutes of dialogue about Gwenda discovering why she had been in this house before. Miss Marple finds the previous cook, Mrs. Paget, who was amazingly available to take on the job right away. And for those of you Sherlock fans, I guess she has a career. Una Stubbs has a career of playing housekeepers because she was Benedict Cumberbatch. She was Mrs. Hudson.
Yep.
She was Sherlock's housekeeper too. And she was able to take on the role right away, and they're able to discover all of this backstory. And Mrs. Paget, when Gwenda says, "Do I have any family here?" she's able to identify Helen Marsden. They find Dr. Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy was known to be your birth mother's, what everybody's claiming is your birth mother, Claire's brother. She had a brother, Dr. Kennedy. And this was the time when somebody should have started saying, well, what about Helen Marsden? Does she have any background? No one ever said, where is Helen Marsden from? Who are Helen Marsden's people? Where did Helen Marsden go to school? Where was she born? Claire made up Helen Marsden out of whole cloth and showed up in Dilmouth like a Roman candle, and no one says anything about the fact that she has no background. She has no background whatsoever. And I think if this would have been brought out, just like if it would have been brought out, we couldn't reach the body in the gorge in India, then it would be less out of the blue for the audience to say Helen and Claire are the same person. The first time we watched this, I was really shocked. It does help to watch a movie a second time frequently. It really does, because you know what's going to happen, and so you can see all the things that you missed. If we would have gotten those two things, we can't reach the body. Car is on fire at the bottom of this inaccessible gorge, and there are tigers, and Nobody knows anything about where Helen Marsden came from, and the Funnybones could have said something. Any of the Funnybones or Mrs. Paget could have all said, Helen never talked about her background. She never talked about her family. She never talked about her upbringing. She never talked about where she's from. She never said one word about anything. Then it wouldn't have been such a shock.
You need to have to be a shock, but you want to have just enough of a clue there to say, when you look back, oh, that's what that means.
Exactly.
There's a point where Kelvin, there's a scene in which Kelvin walks into the hall attracted by Helen singing. And in fact, Gwenda, as a 4-year-old, says, Daddy, she's singing Mommy's favorite song.
Yes, and Gwenda, even though it would have probably been six months since she last saw her mother, but a 4-year-old will remember their mother.
Mm-hmm.
And she doesn't say, Mommy!
Well, I guess she's been told, so she doesn't.
She's changed her hairstyle. She's changed her hair color. She's changed her makeup. Everything is out of context.
Right.
So Gwenda doesn't recognize her
mother. But the point is the fact that that is an actual clue that they are the same person.
Yes,
but it's something you only recognize in retrospect.
Yes, but the real clue should have been Helen has no family. Helen has no background, and we didn't get the body out of the car, because you really do want to play fair with the audience, and I don't think that was fair to the audience. You just need a single line of dialogue from someone. Helen never talked about her background. She just appeared.
Right now, I'm getting the impression you didn't like the episode.
Oh, I loved the episode. I thought it was really great fun. And it was a great ending. And, Lily Kimball had to die in order for everybody to get their happy ending. But hey, she's just a peasant, so who cares? You wonder again about the lack of communication, because Kelvin Holliday they moved to the back of Beyond to make sure that no one would ever find them. And as it turns out, Claire Helen had multiple reasons, and one of them was her brother, Dr. Kennedy. She thought he was creepy. I don't believe that he ever did anything to her. Agatha does not spell out that it was an incestuous relationship, but it was very controlling, extremely controlling. Claire Helen should have told Kelvin why she didn't want to be found for other reasons. She knew that her brother knew that his sister had married Kelvin Halliday. If her brother saw an announcement with Kelvin Halliday's name in it, and Kelvin is a fairly unusual man's name, would he come calling? And of course, that's exactly what happened. He saw the announcement in the Times of their upcoming wedding and said, oh, I'm going to go see the man who married my sister and took her off to India, and discovered to his shock, horror, and amazement that
they're mutual
shock, horror, and amazement. Oh, this woman claiming to be Helen Marsden is my sister Claire.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that if we had gotten a few more clues, it wouldn't have felt as much like Miss Marple pulled the solution out of her knitting bag. And of course, there are various phone calls back and forth in India, finding out more of the background of Claire. She was a fired nursery worker, that she had been accused of theft, that she had been a taxi dancer in a nightclub, but never anything more. That's what Miss Marple assured us. Never anything else. But, it all tied together so beautifully. And you get singing and dancing. You get Bollywood singing and dancing. And you get English singing and dancing. You get some happy ever afters, not just Gwenda and Hugh, a man who is genuinely falling in love with her and actually wants to be there with her, instead of Mr. Vanstone back in India, who is too busy to come to England, while his beautiful, hot, young, much younger blonde fiancée is coping with a murderous past.
Well, which she doesn't tell him about. So there's one point where
she doesn't tell him? That's right.
She doesn't tell him. She doesn't tell him. She says, oh, he's got enough on his plate right now.
That marriage would have never worked. She would have been an unhappy, bored trophy wife, and she may or may not have had affairs, but I can guarantee you he probably would have.
Yeah. The one thing that really impressed me about it, and this is why they brought in the comedy troupe as well, is that they have a turning point in their lives as well that summer. Because, of course, not only did one of their members turn up missing, the troupe falls apart. There are revelations such as Janet telling Dickie that she's pregnant.
And Dickie is sterile.
And Dickie is sterile. There was a fist fight at one point. That's one reason why all these people, when they're talking about their memories of that time,
18 years ago,
remember it vividly. So we're seeing these characters, and these are some named people. We have Paul McGann as Dickie, Dawn French as Janet. They're remembering what they were like, and we're seeing them both times. So the makeup was really kind of interesting as well, to try to make them look a little older or a little younger, depending on their true age at the time of filming.
Oh, yeah.
And not make it too obvious. But these are all people, particularly Peter Serafinowicz as Walter Fane, who... that was the one summer in which he was able to break away from his controlling mother, played by Geraldine McEwan as well. Like I said, name actors here.
And it was a golden summer for him, too.
And it made a big change in his life as well, as we see, because he ends up fathering
Janet Erskine's child,
which nobody knew.
Nobody knew. That was also a really interesting bit, because Dickie Erskine, when Janet came to him and said, "I'm pregnant," I would guess she had no idea he was sterile. She knew that he had been married before and the relationship had broken up because there were no children. And she probably assumed, the way most people would assume, it was the wife. Chief Inspector Primer finds that Dickie Erskine's wife is not only still alive, she's married to a sheep farmer in the Outer Hebrides, and she has 6 children. Which tells you right then and there, it was not her barrenness, it was his sterility. And so Dickie Erskine is faced with the troop falling apart because Janet is now pregnant, and it's very difficult to travel up and down with a pregnant woman and then a newborn baby. Helen Marsden is leaving the troop. Jackie Affleck and he had a fist fight. Evie Ballantyne is having her own problems. Lionel Lutf is getting older, and in fact, Lionel dies the next year. So when he falls through a trap door on a stage, and everybody remembers this, and Janet is about to present him with a child he never thought he could have. It is a child of infidelity. But this is the only way he will ever become a father. He will never have a child any other way. He can accept the cuckoo's child and say, "This is my son or my daughter."
And I have to give Paul McGann credit. He really underplays everything. He's a comedian on stage, but off stage he is very almost stone face, except he's always watching, he's always looking. I think that's a very good acting choice, just because it forces you to watch him, and he's having to react to everything else.
Yeah, and you look at him and we talked about this, Bill and I talked about this when we were walking around the block afterwards. We actually saw something very similar in a previous Agatha Christie adaptation, and that was They Were 10, and that is the French slasher version of And Then There Were None. And one of the characters, there were almost no parallels between the French film and the novel in terms of characters other than Vera. But one of the characters was a commando, a French commando. He and his wife wanted children desperately, and he couldn't have. And they thought, of course, it was her. And then finally he went in for the sperm sample, and no, you are sterile. And then his wife comes up, and he doesn't know what to do, and he certainly isn't going to communicate this news to his wife. And then his wife says, "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby. Isn't that wonderful? Oh my God, I'm so thrilled." And he knows it couldn't be him. He spies on his wife to find out who her lover is, because he knows there has to be one. There's a man in there somewhere. Of course, it's his best friend, who is married and has children of his own. And maybe it's a French thing that all of these people seem to pay no attention whatsoever to any of their vows. I know this is fiction, but at the same time, man, everybody behaves incredibly badly. And he chooses not to communicate, sit down with his wife and his best friend and his best friend's wife and say, "You knocked up my wife, but I'm going to accept this child, and I just wanted to make sure that you knew I knew, and I wanted your wife to know what you've been doing." But they didn't do that. Instead, he murdered the best friend and destroyed the lives of like 10 other people. destroyed the lives of at least 10 other people when you start looking at the rotating circles. But Dickie Erskine didn't do that.
Yeah. And he gives, she gives birth to this child who grows up we see him working in Walter Fane's office.
Yes, Walter Fane took him on as a trainee assistant.
And he looks very similar to him, and he's bumbling and diffident. There's a wonderful scene in which Hugh and Gwenda are in his office and they're talking about the house and all that. And there's a crash behind them, and it's the kid
George Erskine
dropping a tray of tea things, and they're all startled, and he's of course very upset about it as well. And of course you don't realize until later, of course they look alike. There's a very good reason why.
And then you get this lovely scene at the end, when all of the secrets are revealed. You see Walter Fane and his mother, Mrs. Fane, and she is so relieved when she discovers that her son Walter wasn't a murderer, and she had been afraid that he had murdered Helen because she was marrying Kelvin and not Walter. She didn't want Walter to marry Helen Marsden, but she also she didn't want her son to be a murderer, and her son never married. Well, he never married because he had loved Janet Erskine. And so Mrs. Fane is relieved and discovers suddenly, to her shock, she has a grandson, which she never thought she would have a grandchild.
Yeah.
And so you see the Erskines, the three of them, Dickie and Janet and George and Walter Fane, playing Happy Family. And
which is a card game popular in England, in which you're forming happy family. These cards all have personalities, names, and you trade cards like gin rummy, maybe, where you're trying to find suits. You're putting together certain cards. So if you get everything, a mother, father, a boy, and a girl, and
to turn into happy families. It's a very English card game, and it's one I had never heard of until we started the Agatha Project.
And yes. And you don't know until one of them makes a bid, and I recognized the card, and I said, they're playing Happy Families, which is a wonderful symbol of this is where they are at. And yeah, this is one of the few Christies, in a way, where we see they have a happy ending, and Jackie Affleck and Eve Valentine, they go off as well. And of course we know Gwenda is going to dump the rich man and marry Hugh.
God only knows what he's going to do for his next job, because he's going to get fired. And I don't know how they're going to pay for the house, but they'll be poor and happy. He'll just find another job. Yeah. And she probably has some money of her own. She'll sell that ruby and diamond necklace, and because that's the whole point of jewelry, is you sell it when you need to.
Oh, you're right.
Yes, she has the ruby and diamond necklace.
That valuable necklace, and probably pay off the mortgage on the house.
Or more likely, they'll her husband, her ex-fiancé, will have to deal with the house because they bought it in his name, and she and Hugh will go off and be poor but happy.
That's right.
But all of these people will get their happy ending, except, of course, for Lily Kimball Tutt and her husband, Jim Tutt, who is now a widower because Lily Kimball Tutt talked to the doctor, because the doctor is a responsible person and she wanted to know what to do. Yeah. And so he strangled her because she knew something.
Yeah, he set up a trap and strangled her.
But everybody else is happy, so it's okay.
Well, it's as okay as it can be for any murder mystery. And
oh, yes.
This is all legitimately one. It really was a bunch of happy endings, unlike at the very end of Crooked House, the Glenn Close version, where you and I both agreed the private detective and the now new heiress are going to get married, and she's going to make him miserable, and he's going to make her miserable.
Oh, yeah.
You could tell.
Oh, yeah. She's going to trample all over him like a doormat. He's going to let her, and she's going to despise him for it. And of course, they now know that her younger sister was a psychotic murderess, and her aunt killed, in a murder-suicide, killed the psychotic little sister, like a 10-year-old, and drove over the cliff, and in a fire explosion where there were bodies in the car.
They certainly can go down and inspect them.
Oh, yeah, because you're down in the quarry. In fact, we've seen burned cars in quarries with bodies in them, because that happened in the body in the library, too.
That's right.
And they found the burned body in the car.
That's right. That's right.
But it was a great episode. It's really fun. And it is definitely, this is one of those that you really should watch it twice. I remember somebody saying somewhere that you watch a movie the first time to see if you want to watch it a second time.
Okay.
Because the second time you see all kinds of things that you missed the first time around.
Yeah.
Half the time you don't know when you go in. You have to go on reviews, but my reviews are the best. You have to go on reviews, and you have to go on other people's word of mouth, and you have to go on what your friends and family say. Oh, I saw this and it was great. But you don't know for you until you sit down and watch it. Is this going to be worth seeing the first time? And is it going to be worth watching a second time? And this was worth watching a second time. I really enjoyed it.
Probably would want to see it again.
Yeah.
I would want to see it again.
Actually, there's a number of the Agatha adaptations that I'd like to see a second time.
Yeah.
And, maybe we'll do that. But I don't have to write
DVDs now, so we might as well get some use out of them. We got 400 DVDs.
Well, I don't have to watch, as long as I don't have to re-review them and re-podcast them, I'm okay.
Yep.
But this was a fun episode. There was some definite rewriting of the text, but I think it was all in the service of the story. It was ITV's Marple taking a risk, and this one paid off.
Yeah. And for the big reveal of the double, that's a prime Agatha Christie trope. The in disguise trope, in which somebody is actually under another name.
Oh yes, and the hidden couple trope, because
Mm-hmm.
Kelvin and Helen were a hidden couple because they were always a couple.
Yep.
And you just didn't know it.
Yep.
And she was really good with that.
Yeah. So this ends another episode of Agatha Christie She Watched. I'm Bill Peschel.
And I'm Teresa, and remember to visit our website and see what our upcoming events are so you can come and meet us in person and talk Agatha Christie. And thanks again for joining us.
And we'll see you at the movies. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Agatha Christie She Watched is Teresa Peschel and Bill Peschel, produced by Bill Peschel. New episodes come out every week wherever you stream your content. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can help support us by going to anchor.fm/mystery and leaving a 5-star rating and review, and by helping to spread the word. To advertise on Mystery She Watched, email Peschel at peschelpress.com. All questions and comments can be emailed to Peschel at peschelpress.com. And thank you for listening.